A very warm welcome, everyone, to our latest podcast. I'm Barry Sadler, and today I'm going to be discussing shipping generations. At a course that I attended recently, the instructor mentioned Generation Alpha. Now, I was aware that we had labelled certain generations, mainly based upon their technological prowess, if you like, and combined that with economic and learning differences, we go from many generations stemming back to those that were born in the late 1920s. So I thought how interesting it would be, particularly as we approach the implementation of the MLC's social connectivity requirements, how interesting it could be to look at these various generations and try to relate them to seafarers that have served in the past, that are currently serving, and those who will serve in the future. As I say, the generation label at the moment goes back to the late 1920s with what is termed the silent generation. Now, they're defined as people that were born from 1928 to 1945. They were the children of the Great Depression and World War II, and their parents faced great economic hardship and really struggled to provide for their families. Obviously, back then there was very, very little technological advancement going on, mainly due to the end of the First and the Second World War. Now, seafarers that served during those days were probably preoccupied with what was going on with the war, and even when that generation became old enough to go to sea, they were still used to traditional means and means that had been taught to them under times of real duress. So they had very, very little access to any electronic aids to navigation. Even radar was developed after the Second World War, so the radars that they may have had access to in the latter parts of their career were very, very basic. After the war came the baby boomers. Now, the baby boomers saw childhoods in the 1950s and the 1960s, and of course this is when the United Nations was formed, and then the IMO, so we started to see minimum international standards coming in. So by the time the baby boomers were ready to serve at sea, standards were put in place to help them serve both safely and expeditiously with regards to modern technologies, or technologies that were seen as modern in those days. Baby boomers were the captains, if you like, when I went to sea, and for most of my deep sea going time I was commanded by a baby boomer. Very traditional in their outlook, and in my opinion very, very reluctant to embrace modern technology. The Mark 1 eyeball was something that the baby boomer captains used to say to me when I was a junior officer and had my head stuck in a radar. Used to say, look out of the window. Very traditional and not very open to any kind of technological intervention in keeping a watch. Along comes Generation X. Now, I'm Generation X. Generation X fundamentally 1965 to 1980. I was born in 1969, so I am Generation X, so I should be able to talk most knowledgeably about this generation. When I went to sea, things like ARPA were just coming into use. Automatic radar plotting aids, an advancement on the radar that allowed automatic radar plotting to give us course and speed of targets without having to manually plot them. My second ship, a very, very large bulk carrier, didn't have an ARPA, wasn't required to have one due to its age, and all of our radar plotting was done using a Chinograph pencil, something that fills me with real dread when I think about it today. One of the things about Generation X, my generation, is that we were exposed to massive amounts of change. As we went through our careers, we saw huge changes in technology, digitalization of many of the things that we took for granted, and we have seen both ends of the spectrum. I, as a young cadet in 1985, served on a ship that pretty much didn't have any real advanced electronic plotting on its radar. The satellite navigator was very, very unreliable. It was something called a transit satellite navigator, not like GPS fixing every couple of seconds, but literally fixing every few hours based upon the transit of a satellite. Radio direction finding equipment and other analog systems are what I had to learn to navigate with. I've now been a pilot for 24 years. I carry a portable pilot unit on an iPad with an electronic chart, a ship's position, a ship's shape and predictor, and advanced contours on my electronic chart. This is a portable unit that I take with me, which it seems incredible that I've been able to go from one end of the spectrum to the other. But nonetheless, that's what Generation X was all about. It was all about change at sea. And I think, and hopefully I don't speak for too many Generation X's that disagree with me, is that we are a generation that accepted change. We are a generation that looked for change, looked for technical advancements, looked for better ways of doing things, rather than the previous generation, the baby boomers, or indeed the silent generation, who were very resistant to technological change. So as a Generation X, I see myself as being, if you like, a guinea pig as all of these new technologies came into use. ARPA, electronic charting, AIS, full digitalization and data transmission, which we now have through our satellite providers. Next come the millennials. The millennials were born between 1980 and 1994, and they're known as Generation Y, generally marked by an elevated use and familiarity with the internet and mobile devices, but they were people from the developing world who became increasingly well educated because they were familiar with the internet. They were able to obtain facts much easier than my generation. Generation Y, or the millennials as they are sometimes called, when they were serving at sea, when they went to sea, a lot of the technology had already started to become implemented and indeed become legislated for. Generation Y were very used to data, very used to using electronic devices. They were more used to the ability to access data rather than the ability to use an electronic device. They knew the benefit of digitalization and data because they were born with familiarity with the internet and with data. When it comes to those serving at sea, your Generation Y guys, your millennials, were used to seeing technology on ships. When they joined a ship, they were used to seeing advancements that I had seen develop. A millennial would go on board a ship and would expect to see some form of technology available to assist them in their duties. I think if you were to put a Generation Y or a millennial on a ship without any kind of technology, they would feel out of place, because even though they weren't brought up staring at screens, they still expected a certain level of technology based upon their familiarity with, in particular, the internet. This made them very, very good learners. Because they had access to so much information, they started to elevate educational programs and they started to learn very, very fast. Some say this is a disadvantage because the Generation Y, your millennials, were learning so fast that perhaps they were becoming over-reliant on very young technology. Because they were learning fast, they wanted things to advance faster perhaps than they were able to. From the mid-1990s, so 1995 up to 2014 came your Generation Z. Now, Gen Zs are what we call digital natives. Yeah, they grew up with access to both the internet and portable digital technology. This means that they were very, very used to holding portable devices and able to access data with a portable device. Now, all of my children are Gen Z, and they all have mobile phones, and they all are distracted by screens. They aren't brought up on screens from a very, very young age. Screens were introduced to them when they were in their teens, their early teens. But nonetheless, they are very, very used to portable digital technology. Therefore, they're very, very used to very, very high-tech pieces of kit. Obviously, our young officers are now Gen Zs, and they expect very, very high levels of technology. They expect there to be an electronic chart on board. They talk about paper charts as if they were something from history. They talk about a radar that's not a digitally produced picture as something from history. So they have moved beyond the early days of technology into being watchkeepers that rely on fairly advanced technology. Their opinion is the technology is there, so we must use it. It's not seen as an aid anymore. It's seen as a necessity, and that's coming through in legislation. Generation Z are there as the go-to guys now because the technology has become so advanced that what's left of the baby boomers and the Generation X, what's left of those at sea, tends to be those that don't understand the latest technology, whereas Gen Z have grown up with it. They've grown up with small portable devices, and they expect big devices on ships to be very, very high powered and have very high capabilities. They are, of course, digital natives, so they are very used to dealing with data and dealing with high volumes of technology. So if we now think about our future seafarers, our future seafarers are this Generation Alpha, which is what made me think about this podcast. This new generation that were born from 2010 to 2024. So the oldest that they are at the moment is 14, so they're not at working age. But these are what have been described by many as the screen age. These are children who, from a very, very early age, were put in front of a screen. Screens were used as pacifiers, entertainers, educational aids from very, very young. And therefore, this new generation of seafarer that will start coming to sea in 2 or 3 years' time are used to looking at screens. They expect the ability to be able to download and use data in very, very large amounts, and therefore, if they do start to serve at sea without the ability to access data, this may indeed be a source of stress for them. The inability to look at a screen may be a source of stress for them. Generation Alpha are, if you like, a generation that has been almost experimented upon. They are the first generation to be born into a screen age, and therefore they are seen by many as being guinea pigs of a total digital age. This does have some negative effects, which I think if they find themselves going to sea, might play against them, particularly when they become watchkeepers, particularly bridge watchkeepers. One of the downfalls of the Great Screen Age was that they have shorter attention spans. The reason they have shorter attention spans is obviously staring at a screen for long periods of time isn't something that they liked to do, particularly when they were young. Youngsters become very, very bored with the same thing, and therefore, although the screens were put in front of them at the youngest of age, they did not engage with those screens for much time, and therefore they have very short attention spans. If we apply that to a watchkeeper on watch for 8 hours a day, your attention span needs to be excellent for those 4 hours. And so at the end of the day, a Generation Alpha may be searching for something different other than, for instance, keeping a good lookout. Now, we do have technology there to help us keep a good lookout, and I'm sure Generation Alpha will use that. But nonetheless, we do have to be careful when we start to put this generation at sea that they do not become over-reliant on the screens that they have been used to from an early age. It will be imperative to show them that there are multiple means of achieving something, and part of those means of achieving something will include the ability to use their eyes and to look rather than rely on advanced technology. Generation Alpha will learn very efficiently. The increase in screen and technology, Generation Alpha will want information to be given to them through that screen, and therefore they will engage with various means of learning, not just academic learning through teaching and lecturers. They will rely on information being delivered to them via the smallest, most portable screen available. So if we're teaching something critical to a Generation Alpha, there's absolutely no point in giving them even a small notebook. Everything will need to be delivered through a portable, efficient device that is designed to feed information to them in the most convenient means. Shorter attention span means that we can only give them shorter data bursts, and so future seafarers will need to be educated and indeed will need to keep watches based upon short bursts of data rather than prolonged concentration. This, of course, leads to more automation, and that in turn may lead to it not being quite as efficient in watchkeeping as the earlier generations were. Some people have likened the year that Generation Alpha began to the year that the iPad was launched. The iPad and other tablets as they came out were a very efficient screen, and so therefore it was easy to put these things into the hands of Generation Alpha, and therefore this is what gave them their yearning for a screen, shall we say. It's going to be really interesting to see Generation Alpha come to sea, and as an educator myself, I am going to be acutely aware of how they learn and how they operate at sea. In my opinion, devices that are used to enhance the safety of navigation and enhance watchkeeping need to be designed to appeal to Generation Alpha. There needs to be a screen, it needs to be a small device, possibly a portable device, and one that does not require them to stay in the same place and watch the same screen for huge lengths of time. Educating Generation Alpha, making sure that Generation Alpha are safe watchkeepers, is going to be a real challenge for the industry. And There's no better place to start than now. Let's prepare ourselves for Generation Alpha becoming seafarers by ensuring that data is available to seafarers, that the technology that is brought to bear within the bridge encompasses these later generations, holds their attention, and makes them safe and efficient watchkeepers. Thanks for listening, guys, and once again, have a great 2025.